Hello, everyone. I'm Nora Saraki, and I'd like to welcome you to the third installment of our online Shoreline Symposium. This event is brought to you in partnership between the BCK CISMA, the Stewardship Network, and the Southwest by Southwest CISMA. We are cooperative invasive species management areas, and we exist throughout the state to help landowners and managers better address invasive species issues. Fallon is the manager for the BCK CISMA, which serves Berry, Calhoun, and Kalamazoo counties. And I manage the Southwest by Southwest Corner CISMA, which covers Berrien, Cass, and Van Buren counties. We're lucky with this event to be partnering with the Stewardship Network, which is a fantastic organization based in Ann Arbor to help us with some of the tech. Rob is helping us host today, so if you have any tech questions, you can put those in the chat and he will be able to help. The BCK CISMA and the Southwest by Southwest Corner CISMA work together to bring in speakers and stakeholders to better understand riparian issues and lake issues back in 2019 with an in-person Shoreline Symposium. And so we're excited to be able to bring this online and make it a little bit more accessible as well to help people better understand in this format some of these issues. Those who are registered for this event are also registered for the last part of this event, which will be next week, where we have another member of Eagle staff coming in and talking about some of the permitting issues with managing lakes. So please join us for that as well. Lastly, just a few bit of pieces of housekeeping. Please do feel free to introduce yourself and your lake in the chat. That can be found at the bottom of your screen. And then if you have any questions, we'll have a Q&A at the end. Please use the Q&A feature for that so that we can keep those separate and we can make sure that we ask all of your questions. With that, I'd like to introduce Tom Alwin, who is a senior aquatic biologist with the Eagle Water Resources Division. Eagle, Michigan's Department of Energy, Great Lakes and Environment, formerly DEQ, is a key partner in our effort to help stop the spread of invasive species and to help protect our lakes. You may know him from Eagle's always insightful Environment YouTube series, where he really helps break down some of these issues into smaller little bite-sized chunks. I've been lucky enough to work with Tom on a few projects, and I'm really glad that he's able to join us here today with an update on aquatic invasive species. Thank you for joining us, Tom.
Managed to unmute myself. Thanks, Nor. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Really grateful for the Stewardship Network folks for hosting this, and Nor and Fallon for inviting me to come talk. Let me get my screen shared, which will take me a moment. A little bit about myself. Nor did a nice job of introducing me. And I work for Eagle. I've been there since about 2009, late 2009, like that funny period between Christmas and New Year's where no one's in the office. So really 2010 was my first year there. I've had a couple jobs with Eagle. I started out in the Aquatic Nuisance Control Program, which issues permits for herbicide application to lakes and streams and Michigan surface waters. And that's actually the next Monday will be one of my former coworkers there, Eric Bacon, will be talking about permitting and give you some insights on how to do that. I also worked in the surface water assessment section where I did like stream biomonitoring for a couple summers, and then I was lucky enough to score this job, which is working with the Aquatic Invasive Species Program. I do a fair bit of early detection and response work across the state, and it's by far my favorite job. I think I'm one of the luckiest people in Eagle. I think it's a great gig. Other than that, I'm working from home since last March. You can see my beautiful unfinished basement where I keep myself busy working. So I opted to follow the rules and use Eagle's template. So it's kind of a boring PowerPoint for my taste, but it is what I'm supposed to use. So here we go. I have my contact information on here. You know, you can reach out to me with questions about aquatic invasive plants, just aquatic plants in general. I'm happy to help try to identify those things for you. And as we go on, I'll talk about some invasives that hopefully you guys will be on the lookout for, and let us know if you find. Um, most talks that I give, I like to sort of start at the bottom and introduce some definitions so folks can be on the same page as we move forward through. So that is what I'm going to do. Let's see if I can advance my slides appropriately one of these days. There we go. So we'll start out with what an invasive species is, and you guys probably have examples that you know of or think of, but it's important to have a good working definition for what an invasive species is. You can probably find a few of them out there on the internet. This is the one that the state of Michigan uses, and it's really got two key components: that species has to be non-native, and it has to cause harm, either economic, environmental, or human health. And it's really important that it has both of those things. There's lots of non-native things out there in the world that we as humans really value. You know, for Michigan, cows are not native, but yet we don't consider them invasive. Yeah, they may do some harm, but we value them more than we devalue them. So it's kind of a human construct, the idea of invasive species. I mean, those invasive species out there right now, they don't know that they're an invasive species. They're just living their lives doing what a species does. It's that human concept of it's invasive, and therefore we need to do something. And you know, usually that works out to be treating or you know, preventing it to show up in new places. And they definitely do harm. They impact the native ecosystem often. There's definitely, you know, cascades with economic impacts with a lot of them, and very few actually have direct human health impacts, but it does happen sometimes. Thankfully, not too many of them that end up in our lakes have human health impacts. The other definition I wanted to go over, I mean, I basically took the title and just whacked it in half, is best management. And this is a little bit harder to nail down. The state doesn't have a definition that I'm aware of, so I poked around on the internet a little bit and found a portion of a definition that I liked, and so that's what I have up here. You know, everyone's idea of best is probably a little bit different, and you know, it's hard to nail it down. You know, the best option may be so expensive that it's not realistic. So as we go through today, I'm going to try to talk through, you know, maybe some scenarios of best management ideas, and talk about kind of how to do the best with what you have, and how to, you know, ideally for me, I like the idea of prevention. And I'm going to stress that quite a bit as we go through as a best management practice. Clicking the next slide. When I was asked to do this talk, it was quite a while ago, and it sort of fell off my radar as we were in our pandemic lockdown. And I can see I already have a typo on this slide, so ignore that. You know, I think a lot of folks would appreciate the idea of really delving into a specific species and talking about, you know, what are those best management practices for that species. But I kind of struggled with that idea, in that every lake is a little different, every ecosystem is a little different. The conditions in which the infestation is also dictate a best management practice. The type of habitat it's in, that species, what particular management goals a group has, and of course that group's budget, all play into what you would maybe do for a particular species. And then just species themselves are more susceptible to one management type or another. I started thinking down that path and thought, you know, I'm gonna step back and go a little broader than that, and hopefully provide information for everyone to benefit from. Because if we talked about, say, curly-leaf pondweed, you know, half of you might have that issue and half of you might not, and so it's not maybe going to be applicable to you. So I'd step back, I'm going to take a broader look at it, and hopefully that provides useful information for everybody. I also really wanted, since this is a series, a 4-part series, I wanted to try to make some good connections between the different talks. So I'm going to try to do that as we go through here. And then ideally, you know, what I want folks to come out of this talk going is, we need to do this, or we need to do that on our lake, or this would help our lake, you know, be able to manage the species better, or prevent this species from coming into the system. So it's kind of where I'm coming from, and we'll revisit these goals at the end and see how I did maybe. So the best way for me to go about this talk is to use the invasion curve. Some of you may be familiar with it. Some of you may not be. I'll walk through. This is kind of like a third definition almost buried in here. The invasion curve is just, it's a concept, a general concept. You wouldn't necessarily be able to go with a particular invasion and follow it exactly. And it won't always be the exact same way for every system or every individual lake. But it's just the general idea of how an invasion occurs and what happens during that invasion. So we have time down here on the bottom, and that can be any scale of time. It could be a very short period of time. It could be a very long period of time. So that's just sort of the general idea of time moving forward. And then on this axis, we have the cost or the effort, and that's generally pretty closely linked to the number of that organism, so like the level of infestation, but it's not exactly. So we're thinking about how much it costs to do that management, or the amount of effort you would have to do to take that management action. And then, you know, you can think about this invasion curve pretty much at any scale as well. So I work for the state. We are concerned about statewide issues, also concerned about smaller scale issues, but our main push for a lot of things, especially these early detection species, is at a statewide scale. So I have the state of Michigan up here, but you could easily just consider your lake during this invasion curve, or taking it even more generally, you could think about this as your lawn. And, you know, like dandelions in your lawn, you know, the amount of time that they're there, they're reproducing, it becomes more costly to do management if there's more of them and they've been there longer. So that's kind of the general look of it. When you actually put the curve on there, it kind of looks like this. So I might be giving away the whole concept of the invasion curve by putting that whole curve on there, but you can see, you know, it starts low with cost and effort, and it moves its way up high pretty quick. And I did want to point out that there's not a zero cost effort point on this scale, and that's really important. If you're not doing anything at all for invasive species, you're just crossing your fingers and hoping they don't show up in your lake. That's not where I want you guys to be. That's not the ideal situation. You should always have some small costs, and that's to do this first step of the process, which is prevention. So, you know, it costs money to do prevention. And so, you know, if you're not going to spend that money on prevention, you're just hoping to blind luck. Prevention can fall into a lot of different ways. And this is a really good opportunity just to think back to what Melissa provided last week, which is talking about forming lake associations, special assessment districts. Those sort of things are really key, even during prevention, so that it's not just one person living on a lake who's concerned about this, who's trying to do this prevention or do this monitoring to figure out prevention. So, you know, and this prevention, ideally, you never have the species get in your lake and all you're doing is prevention, right? So thinking about this on a single species level is kind of how we'll step through it, but you can think about it, you know, prevention goes beyond just one species. You may be concerned about Eurasian water milfoil right now, or another invasive plant, but you should be doing prevention all the time, even if that plant shows up. And so, in my opinion, this is the absolute best management strategy. Obviously, if you don't have that species in your lake, yeah, you got to spend some money maybe monitoring, or spend some money doing some preventative decontamination or cleaning, but you don't have to treat that species. You don't have to spend the money on products or labor to go out and treat that species because it's not in your lake. Um, and I think one of the key points for prevention is really to be prepared. And that's thinking about, as your association or your lake group that gets together, come up with a management plan for invasive species, even if you don't have any in your lake already. And in that management plan, lay out what you guys are going to do for prevention, how you're going to approach, public boat launches, how you're going to approach some of the other things that I'm going to talk through today. But really, this is so key, is prevention. It costs a little money, it takes a little time, but it saves you the headache of having to deal with an invasive species if you can keep it out of your system. Yeah, so even if you don't form a lake association or aren't able to get that together, even just a team of folks, a couple people around the lake, so it's not a burden for one person, is really important. And I think a good way to go. So if I think about prevention and we want to talk about how you prevent stuff from coming in, I think you got to think about where things come from. How is an invasive species going to get into your lake or into your reservoir or your yard or anything like that? We're focused more on lakes today, but you can think about this, like I said, at most any scale. So let's look at the sources. Human introduction is probably the most common cause for an invasive species to get into a new lake. You can see the picture here with the Stop Aquatic Hitchhikers and that trailer full of weeds. That's a classic and well-known method for plants to move around. They get stuck on something that you own or someone owns, and they go from one lake to the next fishing or whatever, and they end up introducing that species. There's been some recent law changes. So it used to be, I think up until 2017 maybe, you could not launch a boat with aquatic plants on it. That was illegal. But in 2017, or it might have been 2018, the law changed. And so now you cannot transport a trailer with aquatic plants or water in the ballasts or anything like that. It's now illegal to just transport it. So, if this picture was taken now, that person would probably get a warning from a law enforcement, person, or potentially a ticket. And I know there has been some increased enforcement through DNR, law enforcement division. We've talked with them quite regularly, and they started kind of slower in the first couple of years, just warning folks, and now they're moving more towards some ticketing if it seems appropriate to them. So that's one way that invasive species move around and can get into your lake. Another one is this gentleman up on top here who's dumping his fish tanks. So water gardens and aquarium releases are also fairly common, or potentially common ways for invasive species to move around. It doesn't always result in an invasive species becoming established. So you dump one fish, that fish isn't going to reproduce. It probably is going to have some impact, but you're not going to end up with a breeding population potentially. This map here is to represent hydrologic connections, which is another way invasive species move. Fish can swim through that channel connecting these two lakes to go from one lake to the next. If there's some invasive plant here and there's flow coming in, which I believe this is actually flow out, but we'll just pretend it's flow in, that plant could break loose or seeds might float down and end up into another lake. So hydrologic connections are a way that invasive species can move around from one lake to the next. And then wildlife can also move them around. Seeds could get stuck to feathers. Some seeds can actually pass through digestive systems unharmed. So, the goose that nibbles on the seeds on this lake flies over to the next one and then deposits some seeds. Those last two, hydrologic connections in wildlife, there's not a lot that we can do to prevent that, but they're probably less likely, and that's a bit dependent upon the species. So really the ways that we can focus on prevention and things that we can do are, to slow down people from moving invasive species around accidentally on their trailers or intentionally by dumping them into the lake or river. And getting a little deeper into prevention, uh, education and outreach is really a really key piece of the puzzle. You know, not everybody knows that that law has changed. So we have boat launch signs, and there's a person here adding an addition to justify and make that law part correct. The new signs we have now actually have that printed on there, but we have stickers that we can put on older ones if we find them. And so putting signage at your boat launch is a great way to inform people. And most state-owned boat launches should have signage already. Occasionally they don't. If they don't, I don't encourage you to go put signs in there. Reach out to the folks who run the launch and make sure that they are aware that you're interested in having that on there or having signage on there. That's not something you should do on your own if it's not your property, obviously. But there's also sometimes county or township launches, and working with those folks to get signage was a really good idea. There's also private launches. You know, sometimes there's a marina on a lake, and, you know, approach the owners and ask if they're willing to have a boat launch sign put up. And even sometimes there's just a resident who lets folks use their launch, and they might be willing to put a sign up too, or have a discussion with folks every time they want to launch off of their boat launch. These signs are actually free. The state of Michigan produces them, and we distribute them out. We'll mail them to you for free. So I have actually a good stopping point is I have a PDF that hopefully will get posted here near the end of the talk that has quite a few of the links that I'm going to talk about, or links to some of the things I'll talk about. But it also has the contact information for my colleague Kevin Walters, who takes care of the boat launch signs. And he would be happy to get an email from you and work on getting you those signs. Like I said, he packs them up and mails them out for free, and then it's up to you to you know, post them and you know, make sure you have permission to do so. Another idea for education and outreach would be, you know, just finding a way to reach out to the folks around the lake. They may not know if there's an invasive species already in your lake. You probably want them to know that. If there's invasive species that you're really concerned about getting in your lake and you want everyone to be on the lookout for them, you know, using a newsletter if you have such a thing, or even like welcome packets to new property owners on the lake is a great idea. You can introduce the lake association if you have it. You can introduce the known invasive species. You can introduce all kinds of really great information to make sure they're all kind of on the same page and understand sort of the way that the lake has been operating, or how you want it to be operating, with prevention and you know, monitoring if you're doing that kind of thing. And then Ripple is a program that's sort of co-led by the Department of Ag and Rural Development, one of our sister agencies, and MSU Extension. And the Ripple stands for Reduce Invasive Pet and Plant Escapes. This program at this point has been really targeted at retail places to educate people when they buy an aquatic plant or a fish that, you know, please don't release that organism. But I could see, you know, looping something like that into your newsletter, a quick little blurb about what Ripple is. And that's another link that is in the PDF I have for you guys. I think they've made some signs too. I don't know that any of them are really intended to go at boat launches, so probably not a good solution there, or yet. That might be something they might branch out into. But you know, the idea of pet releases isn't just coming from you know, your boat launch. Any park that's on your lake or public property is a great place for someone who's trying to, you know, get rid of these things that they don't know what to do with. You know, they might just pull into the park, walk down to the shoreline and dump stuff. So if Ripple comes around to that kind of audience and target, that'd be a great thing to do. And I don't know that it would harm to put Ripple stuff up now if there was something that kind of worked in a particular boat launch, if you had a kiosk or some sort of area for signs. And then the last thing for decontamination is, or sorry, for prevention is really decontamination. And this can come in all kinds of levels. At the most basic, it's just removing plants and mud and water from your boats and fishing gear and inner tubes and all of that stuff. And so decontamination, there's sort of a nice blend that the state has in partnership with MSU for decontamination, and that is they do sort of this mobile boat wash station, which is the picture on the left here with the sheriff's vehicle and boat getting sprayed down. So the partnership, I think, is actually the U.S. Forest Service, MSU Extension, and Water Resources Eagle that sort of all work together to have these stations go around all summer. And now I know they didn't do it last year due to the pandemic. I'm not sure what the plans are this year if they're planning to do this, but they basically fill up their schedule where it's a couple MSU students who have this mobile boat wash station that they can come to your boat launch and they'll wash boats for free. And now the idea is to teach people about decontamination, because one day at a boat launch isn't going to stop an invasive species from getting into your lake, but it's going to help all those people that they talk to think about it next time they go to a lake and work on, remembering to decontaminate and taking the time to do it. That's sort of a mobile boat wash angle. Some CISMAs have mobile boat wash stations, so you might reach out to your CISMA to see if they have such a thing and are willing to come to your lake for a couple days during the summer. Other lake associations, depending on ownership of a boat launch, will put up their own boat wash station. So this other picture is from Glen Lake, and they have a heated pressure washing station at their boat launch that anyone can use. Come up and just wash their boat off. And that's a great solution if you're able to do that. DNR has done a couple as trials. They're not really ready to take that investment because there's a whole lot of maintenance and staffing that's required to run these. So they aren't putting them into state-owned boat launches at this time. But I know some lake associations have reached out to the DNR and have tried to work out ways that they can have a boat wash station there. Maybe the association helps with some of the costs or some of the state, management and running of the boat wash. That's outside of my area of expertise, but that's something that you might consider is if you have a public boat launch, trying to work with the owners about getting a wash station in there. There's also a newer kind of concept, an idea that's popped up the last year or so that I've heard about, where folks will not have this really intensive pressure washer and water heater system, but something really simple where it's just a couple of grabber tools and some brushes that are available for people to come in, and it's sort of just a little kiosk area that people can use. Only effective if people use it, obviously, for decontamination, and you probably will end up with some of those items getting broken or taken or something like that. So there's some maintenance with that, but these are all sort of preventative ideas with education and outreach, decontamination that you can take to sort of really help keep your lake invasive species free, or at least free of any new invasive species. Prevention is also really good for your neighbors. So you may have an invasive species already in your lake, but your neighboring lakes don't. So if you can get folks to do decontamination, then ideally they're not going to take that species from your lake and bring it over to a lake that maybe doesn't have it. So it's not just helping you, it's helping regional folks as well, everyone else around you who has lakes that have access. Another really important idea for prevention is monitoring, and it's one that maybe doesn't pop in your head right away, and this is a good connection to what Melissa was talking about, as well as Eric in the first two presentations during this seminar group. So monitoring is just going out to your lake and looking to see if you have that invasive species or any invasive species in there. And you really can't run a good prevention program without knowing what's there. You know, you don't know if you're preventing that species from getting in your lake unless you go out and look for it in your lake intentionally. Now, you might notice it eventually if it gets in your lake. Once it's gotten to a point that it's, you know, widespread or you know, established. But the ideal way of going about monitoring is doing what's called early detection. So finding those species as fast as you can, as soon as you can, once they're in a system, because as we'll see from the curve here in a minute, that's really a crucial thing, is to find them early. Just like anything else, you know, once you start getting more of that species over time, population goes up, the costs and the efforts are going to go up. So some ideas for monitoring the Exotic Aquatic Plant Watch. I believe Melissa brought that one up last week. There is a link in the PDF we'll share with you guys. Even just training your residents about what species you're on the lookout for. So say you're worried about, you know, these handful of species, you know, using that newsletter idea or that welcome packet, introduce the folks around the lake to the species that you're worried about, so that they can, if they notice it wash up on their shore, they can go back to that materials and they can say, oh yeah, that's curly-leaf pondweed, or yeah, that's European frogbit. I need to make sure I report that to my lake association folks. So having residents aware and understand what species you're concerned about, definitely a plus. It's just more eyes on the water, more eyes looking around. And then you can also hire professionals. There are lake managers who will come to the lake for a fee and do, you know, lake-wide monitoring. They'll go around and they can map the plant beds. They can identify all the species that are in there. You know, it just depends kind of on do you have an association? Do you have a big budget? What do you guys have available to do this? So you can go all the way from, you know, real grassroots with Exotic Aquatic Plant Watch and folks around the lake looking, or you can go to the level of paying to have folks come in, professionals to come in and look around. And I think, as Eric sort of provided in his first talk, you know, there's a lot of aquatic plants out there, but it's not too hard to whittle it down to figure out if it's an invasive plant or not. And Exotic Aquatic Plant Watch helps you. They help train you. They help to make sure you know. And so they're a great resource to get started on that. But you can also, you know, my contact info is in the title slide. And, you know, if you guys sort of take this on your own and you just have residents looking out, you know, important, once you find a species, if you're not sure what it is, to get some decent pictures of it. And you can email those to me or your CISMA, or potentially even the Exotic Aquatic Plant Watch people, and they can help you to identify what that plant is, whether it's a native one or an invasive one. But without monitoring, you're really never going to, you know, if you're going to figure out an early detection, and that's where this next piece comes in. So, you know, you take all those steps and you do prevention. You know, it goes really well, but it's still really hard to stop something from eventually getting into your system. So in our little diagram here, we have an introduction, and I pick on Southeast Michigan all the time because they seem to have a lot more issues with invasive species than a lot of other parts of the state. But our species has gotten introduced, so we're kind of done with preventing that particular species. But again, you don't want to stop with prevention. You want to keep the foot on the gas for that one, because there are lots of other invasive species, and you want to make sure you're keeping those out. And you want to make sure that new one that just got into your lake isn't going to get to all your neighbors' lakes. So prevention continues on even after we move on and we get an introduction. But for the sake of our diagram, no, we're not moving to the diagram. Sorry, I lied. So introduction, like I said, don't stop prevention. In fact, you might decide to increase prevention because, well, obviously an invasive species got in while you were doing your prevention work. You might need to step it up and do a little more if you can, if you have the funding and the personnel to do that. And then you need to really take the time, and this is probably even additional monitoring perhaps, or maybe exotic aquatic plant watch gets you the information you need, but you need to know how bad is that infestation, because that is a big piece of the puzzle of how you move forward with control and management. Um, and then once you know how much that invasive species is in the system, and you maybe you've done some research on that particular species, you should work on setting appropriate management goals. Um, and so for some species, an appropriate management goal, if you find it early, can be eradication, which is what this picture is depicting here. There's a little dock here, and that's water lettuce along the left side of the dock floating there, which is an aquatic invasive plant, legal to own and possess in Michigan, but not supposed to be loose in the wild. It's supposed to be in your water garden or your fish tank. But water lettuce is nice in that it's a floating plant. It's really easy to see, and it's fairly easy to remove. You just scoop it up, put it in a garbage bag, and dispose of it properly, and you're done. So you could set a management goal of eradication for water lettuce and a few other ones, and be pretty successful at it. Other species, eradication might not be possible. So let's talk a little bit more about eradication as I try to change my slide. All right, so we've moved beyond the prevention and the introduction and into eradication. And this is usually a pretty narrow window. You're not going to have a lot of time to make it in this window. And a lot of folks, even within the state, have this conceptual idea of that once you have an invasive species, you're always going to have it. You're never going to get rid of it. Eradication is not possible, but that is not always the case. There are times where that certainly is the case. There are probably a lot of times where that is certainly the case. Very species dependent, and very dependent upon catching that whatever species it is early. So if you can do that early detection and you can catch those species early, you can actually eradicate some aquatic plants with fairly good success. It's not always one and done. You might have a few years of managing, but it is possible. The program I work in with early detection, we've had a number of eradications, and we haven't dealt with anything or achieved an eradication at a lake-wide scale, because most of the things that we've had that come in are in small residential ponds or stormwater detention ponds, which are much smaller and much easier to manage. So scale of the system, as well as the amount of plants and how early you find them, definitely makes a big difference. But this eradication piece, definitely not impossible, not easy. And if you're not doing that monitoring ahead of time, you can blow right past it and not even realize you had the species and you had that window for eradication. And then all of a sudden, you're into the next step. Talk a little more about eradication. This is again where that management plan, I feel like, really could inform what you guys are going to do. So say you have an introduction of something, you find it early, your management plan maybe breaks down what the next steps are, contacting professional managers, contacting the state depending on the species, and working through getting some control actions going on that species as early as possible. And so you can still eradicate some species early on. Have I made a case for monitoring? I hope so. That's what I'm shooting for. Again, it's not necessarily easy to eradicate. Sometimes it takes a lot of time. Sometimes it takes not just spraying the plants, but actually going out and removing them. This is a picture of my colleague Bill and I in front of a giant pile of parrot feather. We went out in November to this site and raked out, I don't even know how much. There was probably about half again that much in another pile over here of parrot feather that we pulled out of this pond. And thankfully, and that effort, that pulling out, we have resulted in only finding a couple of stems of parrot feather in that pond since that. And that was, I think we did that in 2017 or 18. So we've had a couple summers now with almost no parrot feather. in the pond because we went out and just yanked all of it. We were treating it with herbicide and it just wasn't effective with that much biomass. So after removing the biomass, treatments were much better. So that's an example of, knowing the species you're dealing with, and then taking the approach of management as best you can. So I'll get into species level stuff in a little bit, but herbicide is often a solution. Sometimes it takes more than just herbicide to eradicate. And we're not at eradication at this one. That's another key point I think I should point out to you guys. For the state, our definition of eradication for an aquatic plant is 3 consecutive years without us observing that plant at all. So you find one stem of parrot feather in this pond in 2021, and we will be back to the drawing board for another 3 years. 2022 will start the 3-year consecutive run of not seeing that plant. Parrot feather is also a great plant in some ways in that it only reproduces by fragments. There's no seed reproduction, so there's no seed bank. So once you kill all the viable plant matter, you're doing pretty good for getting eradication. All right, so let's say you missed the eradication window. The next step in the invasion curve is the control and containment. And so you can see by the map of Michigan, the species that we're talking about, it's kind of all over the place. It's not everywhere. You still want to control it where it is in a lake so that it doesn't take over the lake or, just cause massive problems or easily spread from that lake to the next. So you're working to contain it to where it is and then hopefully minimize it. But you've passed that point of eradication. And so you're into control and containment. And this is where a lot of lakes are if you have an invasive species in it already that's established. So, Eurasian water milfoil, good example. Curly-leaf pondweed might be a good example. Starry Stonewort, another good example. Those are all plants that have been established in the state for quite a while. Maybe not in all parts of the state, but in the state. And once they get in the system, those ones are tough to eradicate. But once they're in the system, you're sort of stuck in this control and containment. And you could be stuck in this control and containment then for forever. It's kind of you're managing it, you're spending money on herbicide or manual removal or physical removal, whatever your management strategy is. But you're never going to eradicate it. It's too widespread. Now, one of the things about lakes that's important to think about is they're all very different, and not all of them are really well-suited habitat for some invasive species. So Eurasian water milfoil is a pretty good example. There are lakes where it gets in and maybe it has a year or two of explosive growth and it's a big deal. And then even without those folks doing any management, it sort of dies back and incorporates with the rest of the aquatic plant community and doesn't ever become a big problem again. Why that is, the habitat conditions aren't right. Maybe the substrate isn't good. The water quality is too clean. Who knows? But you don't always end up with a massive problem once you have an invasive species get in. Sometimes you get lucky and it sort of just fits in with the rest of the community and it's fine. Zebra mussels are a good example of that. They are in a lot of lakes in Michigan, and a lot of times they have this huge explosion of population and then they sort of die back, and they're always in the lake, but they're never that big a deal, because the conditions just aren't right for them. So that's nature helping us out. Let's see, talking about control and containment, I already said eradication is not possible. I put a little asterisk by once you're here, there's no going back. And that's sort of what I was talking about with, sometimes species just integrate, an invasive species integrates into the system and doesn't really cause the big problems it does in other places. Just for whatever reason, it's not going to do that. If you're in that control and containment section of the invasion curve, the state does have some status and strategy documents on our website. It's a little bit, it takes a few clicks for you to get to them. but I have the link to the main invasive species website for the state in that PDF that we'll share. But once you're in there, if you click on species and then you select aquatic, and then you select, no, you select plants and then you select aquatic, I think. And then you select the species. Down near the bottom of some of the species, there is a status and strategy document, which will help you learn about how that species lives, its life cycle, life history, as well as some management options. What is currently, or at least relatively currently, some of them are a few years old, work as far as management strategies. So I would recommend, if you have an invasive that you're working on, to check that out. Lake managers, I sort of mentioned them before in that monitoring part. There are folks who their job is to monitor and manage lakes, and they'll provide you with survey results and recommendations for treatment, or recommendations for prevention. The lake managers can provide you some pretty useful information. Another one that are the folks that go out and do the herbicide treatments. They can also usually recommend some management strategies, and you may end up hiring those folks to do treatments on your lake depending on the species and your budget. Another great option would be reaching out to like MLSA or some of the other organizations your CISMA may be able to help find you some more resources for what to do with a particular species. But the status and strategy documents, the ones we have, are fairly good. We're trying at the state level to do more of that, provide direct information from folks. So it's a good opportunity for me to plug a document we created a couple of years ago called Michigan's Landowner's Guide to Aquatic Invasive Species Management. Again, there'll be a link in the PDF we'll share, but that sort of walks you through a whole lot of process from prevention and monitoring and what sort of things you need for permits. And that's actually the discussion for next week with Eric Bacon will be permits. So I would tune in to see what he has to say about that as well. But the Landowner's Guide is a pretty text heavy. It's not a real nice picture-y one, but it's a lot of information and a lot of good information. And you can get that PDF on the Invasive Species website, the states. And again, that link is in the PDF. See how we're going here. Control and containment. I don't want to talk too much about this. It's going to be specific to the species you're dealing with and sort of what level that species is there. Eric will talk about permits next week. I did want to talk a little bit about indirect management, and this is where Melissa also mentioned with shoreline, buffer zones, keeping fertilizer and nutrients out of the lake any more than you can. Those fertilizers just feed the plants. So if you have a bunch of fertilizer running off your lawns into your lake, you're just feeding the aquatic plants, both native and invasive. But invasives tend to have a competitive edge over natives, which is part of the reason why they're invasive. So doing that indirect management with the stuff on the shoreline is really important. Also things like not washing your cars on your driveway. That soap ends up oftentimes getting down through the storm drains and into a river or lake and feeding plants. The other thing I wanted to mention quickly here is timing of management. So if you're doing management, whether it's eradication or even control and containment, or the next scary one that I'm going to show you, the timing of your management is important. So plants that reproduce by seed, you want to be out there doing your treatments before they produce flowers and before they produce seeds, so you don't have all those plants next year that you're going to have to deal with. Similarly, some plants like curly leaf pondweed form what's called a turion, which is an overwintering structure. If you go out and you treat before they produce those overwintering structures and you remove those plants or you treat them with herbicides, then you're not going to have as many plants to deal with next year because there won't be that reproductive cycle. You're able to break that. So something to think about if it's possible. And then last on the invasion curve is this asset-based protection. This is a scary place. Obviously, no one wants to get to this point. And the concept here is, from where we're coming from with aquatic plants, they've spread all over the whole, almost the whole lake. Maybe there's, all you're doing now is managing, you know, some sort of lanes so you can get boats out from docks into the deeper water where those plants are not growing, are unable to grow. You know, you're protecting what you can protect. Maybe there's a wetland on one side, and so you're trying to protect that wetland by treating, but you're not able to treat the whole lake because the cost is just, you know, too much. And a good example of that plant doing that is Starry Stonewort. This is a picture of Starry Stonewort, and it just forms blankets across the whole bottom of the shallow parts of your lake where the sunlight gets down far enough for the plant to grow. And it can actually grow fairly deep. So, you know, you can roll just acres of this stuff, and it gets all caught up in your prop. You know, so you can't really get your boat out of the dock. So you'd be doing asset-based protection at this point, where you're just treating those small zones so you can get your boat off the dock and out into deep water, or maybe small areas where folks want to swim. Hopefully, I don't like anyone going to that point. So, but there's a lot of steps between that asset-based protection, starting with prevention. So really stressing that prevention is the best management practice you can do. See what we got here. We can check in. Hopefully I made a decent job of connecting the different talks that we've already seen and the one you will see. You know, plant identification is key for knowing if you have invasive species in your system. You know, working with the other folks around the lake, forming a lake association, really key pieces of the puzzle. And then if you have a species you need to manage, you're going to need, more than likely, a permit to do that. So Eric's talk coming up next week will be one you want to tune into. I hope you learned something, and I hope you're motivated to form an association and do some prevention, because that's really key. And then this is a picture of me when I set off a life vest. I forgot I was wearing it. End of the day, it was raining. I jumped in to do our snorkel survey and yeah, set off the life vest. From that, I think we can go to questions, and I will pop down the hyperlink thing too. What do we got, Fallon?
Okay, so there's a question about overwintering in Michigan with a few different species, so I'll go one by one.
Sure.
Has parrot feather?
Yes, parrot feather overwinters. I've actually seen it growing underneath the ice.
Yeah. Water lettuce?
At this point, water lettuce and water hyacinth, neither one of those are confirmed to overwinter in Michigan. We have one site where we found both species about 3 or 4 years in a row. So we were concerned there was some overwintering there, but we haven't seen those species in those sites for a couple of years. So it was probably someone dumping their water garden every year around the same time or something that was introducing it to the system. Those two don't. Climate change potentially could throw a wrench in there, and we could end up with some overwintering, but at this point there are not. We've actually had some management sites where we've decided not to manage them because there was a lot of water lettuce and it was found like late in the season, and we're like, it doesn't overwinter, we're just going to let winter kill it. We'll go back next year and make sure we catch it earlier and remove it. Good question.
And the last one was water hyacinth, so you connected those last two.
Yeah, those two really fall under the same kind of blanket in my idea. We see a lot more water lettuce for some reason, but those two species are not prohibited or regulated in the state, so folks can have them in their aquariums or their water gardens, and they grow really good. You know, they grow fast and they cover ponds, so we do see them, you know, a couple every year usually show up out in, you know, natural lakes or rivers or wetlands, and we try to manage those when we can.
That's the only question I have so far. Oh, just kidding. Is watercress considered an invasive? If so, thoughts on control?
Watercress is a tricky one. I've seen things that say it's invasive and other things that say it's not. I think it's one where there's a few different species, and some might be and some aren't. The state is not approaching it as an invasive species at this point. I know it can certainly grow thick, and it can grow you know, like in canals and ditches and sort of plug them up. So it definitely can cause issues. It's one that we probably need to think about and do some research. So we try to pay attention to like what the upcoming issue plants potentially are. We have a whole process that we go through um, to decide if they're what's considered a priority species. We call that a watch list aquatic plant. Um, and at this point, watercress is not on that list for us, but it can definitely get troublesome for folks. And management is certainly an option if you need to do that. You know, and I would tune into Eric's talk next week because he'll help you to understand if you need a permit for what you want to do.
The next question is about Kevin's email. Is it supposed to be mi.gov? Right now it's just at i.gov.
Oh, yes, it is supposed to be mi.gov.
Okay.
Oh man. All right, I'll clean this PowerPoint up before I send it to you guys. Typing fast, and I think I copied it, which is weird, but I must not have. Yeah, it's mi.gov. You can also spell Michigan out if you want, but I prefer shortcuts, so mi is the way I go.
No problem. Where do you classify hybrid milfoils, native or invasive?
We consider that invasive. It is really hard to tell the two apart, and that's actually a really good point. There are some resources where you can send samples out to have it determined if it's a hybrid or if it's pure Eurasian water milfoil. And there's some really cool research going on in that zone where folks are doing testing on the different variants of hybrids to determine what herbicides work and don't work on them. So hopefully within a couple of years, we'll have a better idea where you could maybe send your, this is all hypothetical at this point, but you could collect some sample stems, send it off to a lab. They would tell you what species of milfoil it is or what type of hybrid it is and what herbicides will or won't work on it. Because there are a few hybrids that are becoming resistant to some of the herbicides. So I think that's a really cool thing to look forward to because that's going to be huge. I think there's a lot of people who they don't know which plant it is. They don't know what herbicides are going to work. And some of those treatments are really expensive. So you spend a lot of money on a treatment and then it doesn't work. That's just terrible. You know, that's not good. So, you know, hopefully that comes to fruition and there's some sort of resource that folks can use. I will try to see if I can figure out a good way to share that. I don't know how that lab works, if they're open to people from the public sending them samples or not. But I'm hoping they do get to that point.
Okay. At what point do we decide to stop using chemicals for control and go with another method such as laminar flow, aeration, or diver-assisted suction harvesting?
You know, that is a tough question, and it is not one that I can easily put my finger on. I think you have to look at cost and what you can afford. You have to think about which species you're talking about. You know, it's a tough call, and that's kind of one of the reasons I didn't want to go into species specific stuff. I don't live on your lake. I don't know exactly what conditions you're looking at. You know, I would rely on, you know, potentially talking to lake managers or other folks who've tried some of those methods. You know, because they're expensive as well. And there's just not necessarily a good, like, cut and dry, here's what you need to do. It might be that you want to do a little bit of everything. You know, there might be areas where laminar flow might make sense, and there might be areas where diver assisted suction harvesting might make sense, and there's areas where they don't make sense. So you kind of have to look at your situation individually. And I understand, you know, the politics on lakes are not easy. You tend to get people who are really sure that this is the way, and other people who are really sure this is the way to solve the problem. And sometimes it might be a little bit of both. It's a difficult place. And I try not to tell people that like there's some silver bullet, because usually there isn't. If you're in that control and management and containment stage, you know, you're in that stage, and it's potentially going to be that way for a long time. So maybe experimenting with some small area with a newer technique and seeing what you get would be an idea, as long as the cost isn't too high. But it's really a decision that the folks that live on that lake have to make. Bad cop out, I'm sorry, but I don't want to. I don't feel like I can really say with like definitive answers like, well, this is the tipping scale where you move from this treatment to that treatment.
Have you encountered zombie EWM?
No, I don't think so. I'm not sure that I've heard of what zombie. I've never heard that term necessarily. Something that is that milfoil that just won't die. I'm guessing.
Yeah, I would guess that comes back to life after you killed it.
You know, it depends. So milfoil coming back could be from a number of different things. So depending on what treatment method you're using, if it doesn't kill the roots, that plant will grow back. So if you're doing harvesting, with a big boat and removing it, you're basically like mowing the lawn. You're leaving the roots, you're leaving the plant tops or bottoms, you're taking the tops off. That will definitely come back. Some herbicides are contact herbicides where they kill whatever part of the plant they touch. And those will generally leave the roots behind. And so those plants will generally come back to life. They'll just resprout. Systemics should get all the way down into the root and kill the whole plant, which is another type of herbicide, but doesn't always work. It depends on, the amount of contact time for the herbicide, the concentration that gets to that particular plant. So I mean, there's a lot of ways that milfoil will come back. It can come back from seeds. So you might remove the plants and the roots, but next year it comes back because there were still seeds down in the sediment. So there's a lot of ways it can come back. I'm not sure if I've ever seen a milfoil that just won't die from they tried 5 or 6 different herbicides. Usually they're resistant to 1 or maybe 2 herbicides, and other herbicides still work.
It looks like the zombie term was coined by Dr. Doug Pullman based on his observations of resurrection not long after treatment. So, something to look into.
Yeah, there's also something that happens a lot with milfoil is, it grows up really big and it comes up to the surface, and then there's lots of light, and it sort of traps the wave motion, so it gets really warm in the milfoil beds. And then algae grows on the milfoil. And so then when you treat those plants, sometimes the product doesn't really even get to the plant itself. It kills the algae that's on top of the plant. And so that might be part of what's going on too. Just depends on what the bed looks like and what kind of treatments you're using.
Okay, that's all the questions I see, and we're at 2:00, so I'll let Nor do a little wrap up.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Tom.
Alrighty, thank you again, Tom, for joining us today, and thank you all for coming on to learn a little bit more about best practices when dealing with some of those aquatic invasive species. I do hope to see everybody back next week for our final portion in this series on some permitting questions, which can always be a little bit thorny. So you want to make sure that there's plenty of time to make sure that we have a good idea of how to go forward with that in this coming year. If there are any questions, as always, please feel free to reach out to any of us. And this will be available as a recording on the Stewardship Network's YouTube channel soon. So please feel free to share with your fellow riparians or lake lovers to help spread the information. With that, have a good day, everybody, and thank you for joining us.